In this video, we'll learn student speech on campus. The First Amendment protects citizens' free expression rights from governmental interference. Students have the right to express non-disruptive ideological views at schools, but their expression can be restricted. We'll look at three important U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have established legal principles of student expression. This video focuses on three cases. The first case is the Tinker versus Des Moines 1969 case. This case is about students' silent protest on campus. I'll then introduce a recent case that applied the standards in Tinker. That case is about a school district's policy that aimed to prevent students from kneeling during the playing and singing of the national anthem. The third case introduced in this video is about whether the U.S. Supreme Court 1969 ruling applies to speech by students that occurs off campus but on social media. The U.S. Supreme Court decision is expected to be made by late June 2021. What does the First Amendment say about freedom of expression? We've already discussed the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in the last couple of videos. In addition to freedom of religion, the First Amendment provides freedom of speech protection. Let's start with the 1969 U.S. Supreme Court decision on student expression. It was a landmark decision that defined the First Amendment rights of students in U.S. public schools. In December 1965, a group of adults and students in Des Moines held a meeting at a group member's home. The group decided to publicize their objections to the hostilities in Vietnam and their support for a truce by wearing black armbands during the holiday season and by fasting on December 16 and New Year's Eve. The principals of the Des Moines schools became aware of the plan to wear armbands. On December 14, they met and adopted a policy that any student wearing an armband to school would be asked to remove it. And if students refused, they would be suspended until they returned without the armband. Students were aware of the regulation that the school authorities adopted. On December 16th, two students wore black armbands to their schools. Another student wore his armband the next day. They were all sent home and suspended from school until they would come back without their armbands. They did not return to school until after the planned period for wearing armbands had expired, that is, until after New Year's Day. During their suspension, the students' parents sued the school for violating their children's right to free speech. The lower court's decision was in favor of the school, concluding that the armbands could disrupt learning. Justice Abraham Fortas delivered the opinion of the 7-2 majority. The Supreme Court's majority opinion was that neither students nor teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. The Supreme Court concluded that school officials could not prohibit only on the suspicion that the speech might disrupt the learning environment. The Supreme Court concluded that the wearing of the armbands in the circumstances of this case was entirely divorced from actually or potentially disruptive conduct by those participating in it. It was closely akin to pure speech, which the court has repeatedly held is entitled to comprehensive protection under the First Amendment. Justice Fortas wrote, there was no evidence that the students' silent, passive expression of opinion caused any disorder or disturbance. There was no evidence that the students' expression of opinion collided with or intruded the rights of other students. the school officials acted out of fear of a disturbance from the wearing of the armbands, but undifferentiated fear or apprehension of disturbance is not enough to overcome the right to freedom of expression. Any departure from absolute regimentation may cause trouble. Any variation from the majority's opinion may inspire fear. Any word spoken in class, in the lunchroom, or on campus that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. But our Constitution says we must take this risk, and our history says that it is this sort of hazardous freedom, this kind of openness, that is the basis of our national strength and of the independence and the vigor of Americans who grow up and live in this relatively permissive, often disputatious society. In order for the state, in the person of school officials, to justify prohibition of a particular expression of opinion, it must be able to show that its action was caused by something more than a mere desire to avoid the discomfort and unpleasantness that always accompany an unpopular viewpoint. Certainly, where there is no finding and no showing that engaging in the forbidden conduct would materially and substantially interfere with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of the school, the prohibition cannot be sustained. On the contrary, the action of the school authorities appears to have been based upon an urgent wish to avoid the controversy which might result from the expression, even by the silent symbol of armbands, of opposition to this nation's part in the conflagration in Vietnam. It is also relevant that the school authorities did not purport to prohibit the wearing of all symbols of political or controversial significance. The record shows that the students in some of the schools wore buttons relating to national political campaigns, and some even wore the Iron Cross, traditionally a symbol of Nazism. The order prohibiting the wearing of armbands did not extend to this. Instead, a particular symbol, black armbands, worn to exhibit opposition to this nation's involvement in Vietnam, was singled out for prohibition. Clearly, the prohibition of expression of one particular opinion, at least without evidence that it is necessary to avoid material and substantial interference with schoolwork or discipline, is not constitutionally permissible. In our system, state-operated schools may not be enclaves of totalitarianism. School officials do not possess absolute authority over their students. Students may not be regarded as closed-circuit recipients of only that which the state chooses to communicate. They may not be confined to the expression of those sentiments that are officially approved. The classroom is particularly the marketplace of ideas. The nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas which discovers the truth out of a multitude of tongues rather than through any kind of authoritative selection. Freedom of expression would not truly exist if the right could be exercised only in an area that a benevolent government has provided as a safe haven for crackpots. The Supreme Court concluded that the students wore the black armbands to exhibit their disapproval of the Vietnam hostilities and their advocacy of a truth to make their views known and by their example to influence others to adopt them. They neither interrupted school activities nor sought to intrude in the school affairs or the lives of others. They caused discussion outside of the classroom, but no interference with work and no disorder. In the circumstances, our Constitution does not permit officials of the state to deny their form of expression. Justice Hugo Black and John Harlan dissented. Justice Black had long believed that disruptive symbolic speech was not constitutionally protected. Justice Black wrote, "While I have always believed that under the First and 14th Amendments, neither the state nor the federal government has any authority to regulate or censor the content of speech, I have never believed that any person has a right to give speeches or engage in demonstrations where he pleases and when he pleases." Black argued that the tinker's behavior was indeed disruptive. Justice Black declared that, "I repeat that if the time has come when pupils of state-supported schools, kindergarten, can defy and flout orders of school officials to keep their minds on their own schoolwork, it is the beginning of a new revolutionary era of permissiveness in this country, fostered by the judiciary." The substantial disruption standard established in the Tinker case is still used by courts. Here is a recent case of a high school football player nailed during the playing of the national anthem. A high school student named V.A. played on the school's varsity sports teams. At one football game in September 2017, the student knelt during the national anthem to express a reminder that racial injustice in our country exists, which we must not tolerate. A few students from the opposing high school made racial slurs and threats directed at the VA's school students. In October 2017, the school board asked the school district general council to draft a policy to exclude any type of political activism or protesting. The draft policy states, "Students and staff members participating in actual curriculum program and interscholastic activities may not engage in political activism, including but not limited to kneeling, sitting, or other forms of political protest during the playing or singing of the national anthem during the time reserved for such events. Students or staff members engaging in political activities, including peaceful political protest during the time reserved for this event, are subject to removal from the event and facility and may be denied participation in future extracurricular activities and interscholastic athletic competitions, events, and practices." The draft policy remained a draft and has not been adopted as a district policy. The district council stated that he had created other drafts of this policy and suggested that this version of the draft policy was no longer current. The draft policy was discussed in the school district's board meeting in November 2017. At this meeting, many committee members raised questions and concerns about adopting the draft policy. The board neither adopted nor rejected the draft policy, but instead voted to table the draft policy for potential consideration at a future board meeting. But in the next board meeting in December 2017, the board did not adopt, reject, or discuss the draft policy, even though the draft policy was placed on the meeting's agenda. The draft policy was an item that might subsequently be added to an agenda at some point in the future. The student asked the court to prohibit the district from enforcing the draft policy related to the kneeling during the national anthem. The district court ruled in students' favor. The court applied the standards in Tinker. First, was it an expression? It is well settled that certain actions, though not spoken, are considered speech and protected by the First Amendment. Symbolism is a primitive but effective way of communicating ideas. The court finds that the students kneeling during the national anthem is a speech. This is closely linked to the similar well-known protest performed throughout the country, started by former National Football League quarterback Colin Kaepernick. By kneeling rather than standing during the playing or singing of the national anthem, the student is expressing a similar protest to racial injustice in the United States. The students kneeling was the students' protest to racial injustice. That sends a personal message to the community that is akin to an individual student's display of an armband during school hours. Any reasonable person would interpret the student's expression as being separate and apart from the school's opinion. Second, did it cause a substantial disruption or collide with the rights of others? The court concluded that the students' silent kneeling during the national anthem is unlikely to cause a substantial disruption of or material interference with the school activities or interfere with other students' safety. When the student knelt for the first time, he did so peacefully without incidents. The student knelt peacefully at the second football game. It was only hours after the students kneeling and after the football game that the students from the opposing school made racial slurs and threw water at a few of the school's students. The court did not minimize the impact of racial slurs and threats, but the threats were minimal and did not lead to any physical evidence. The threats were to force the student to stand, and the only action taken was water being tossed from a water bottle, getting one student wet. The school principal confirmed that there was no evidence of a fight during or after the game. Therefore, the student's expression was unlikely to cause a substantial disruption or collide with the rights of others. The court also noted that the schoolroom prepares the children for citizenship, and the proper exercise of the First Amendment is a hallmark of citizenship in our country. The third case we look at here has not been decided by the Supreme Court yet. What's at stake in this decision is whether there is a line between on-campus and off-campus speech in the age of social media. The question is whether the Supreme Court ruling in Tinker applies to speech by students that occurs off-campus. A high school student was disappointed that she did not make the varsity cheerleading team. The student vented her frustration on Snapchat. She posted a picture of herself and a friend with her middle fingers raised, along with caption that used foul language. The post was sent from a convenience store on a Saturday. The student's post was visible for 24 hours to about 250 of her friends on Snapchat. But a cheerleading coach saw it and suspended the student from the team for a year on the ground that the post had violated team and school rules. The lawyer representing the school district argued that Tinker should apply off-campus because off-campus speech can also cause disruption, particularly when it comes to social media. Time and geography are meaningless when it comes to the internet. Deputy U.S. Solicitor General Malcolm Stewart, representing President Joe Biden's administration, also argued in support of the school district. What do you think? Do you agree with the arguments presented here? The Supreme Court is expected to make a ruling on this case by the end of the term in late June or early July. In this video, I introduced 3 cases on student speech. The first case is about students' silent protest on campus. The second case is about a school district's policy that aimed to prevent students from kneeling during the playing or singing of the national anthem. The third case is about whether the Supreme Court's ruling in Tinker applies to speech by students that occurs off campus but on social media.